I never thought I would see the day when federal agents would show up at my doorstep because of an HOA president's obsession with my landscaping choices, but here we are. Let me take you back to where this all started, back when I thought Karen Hendricks was just another overzealous neighborhood busybody with too much time on her hands and not enough hobbies to fill it. I had just moved into Meadowbrook Estates, a planned community about 30 miles outside the city, complete with cookie-cutter houses, manicured lawns, and apparently, one very dedicated HOA president who took her volunteer position more seriously than most people take actual paying jobs. My first interaction with Karen happened exactly 3 days after I moved in. I was still unpacking boxes, still figuring out which room would be my home office, when I heard an aggressive knock on my door. Not a friendly neighbor welcoming knock, but the kind of knock that suggested whoever was on the other side believed they had authority and wanted me to know it. I opened the door to find a woman in her mid-50s, wearing a crisp white polo shirt with the Meadowbrook Estates logo embroidered on it, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon, and wearing an expression that suggested she had already found me guilty of something. "Hello, I'm Karen Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I notice your garage door has been open for more than the permitted 4 consecutive hours as outlined in Section 7.3 of our community guidelines. I'm going to need you to close it immediately and familiarize yourself with the rules." I glanced at my watch. I had opened the garage at 8 a.m. to start unloading the moving truck. It was now 11:15 a.m. 3 hours and 15 minutes. Not 4 hours. But I smiled politely because I was new. I wanted to make a good impression, and I genuinely thought this was just a misunderstanding from someone who was perhaps a little too dedicated to their volunteer work. Before we continue, if you are enjoying this tale of suburban warfare and spectacular revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World for more stories of entitled people getting exactly what they deserve. Trust me, you will not want to miss how this escalates. Over the next few weeks, I learned that Karen's visit was not an anomaly but rather standard operating procedure. She patrolled the neighborhood like a military general inspecting troops, and she found violations everywhere. Mrs. Chen's mailbox was half an inch too far to the left. The Rodriguez family's holiday decorations stayed up 2 days past the January 5th deadline. Young Marcus Thompson made the mistake of parking his car on the street overnight when his driveway was being repaired, and Karen left him not 1, not 2, but 5 violation notices on his windshield, along with a warning that his case would be brought before the HOA board. I tried to stay off her radar, I really did. I kept my lawn trimmed to exactly 2.5 inches as specified in the guidelines. I painted my shutters the approved shade of colonial blue. I made sure my trash cans were never visible from the street except on collection days. But Karen, it seemed, had decided I was her special project. Maybe it was because I was new. Maybe it was because I worked from home, and she saw my car in the driveway during business hours and assumed I was just lazy. Or maybe she sensed something about me that made her want to establish dominance early. The violations started small. She cited me for having a garden hose visible from the sidewalk, even though it was coiled neatly beside my house. She claimed my porch light was too bright and violated the community's light pollution standards, despite the fact that it was the same wattage as every other house on the block. She sent me a formal letter stating that the decorative rocks in my front garden bed were river stones when the approved materials list specifically called for crushed granite. Never mind that river stones and crushed granite look virtually identical to anyone who is not a geological expert or completely unhinged. I complied with every demand. I moved the hose. I changed the light bulb. I spent an entire Saturday replacing perfectly good river stones with approved crushed granite while Karen watched from her car parked across the street, her phone pointed at me, presumably documenting my compliance for her meticulously organized files. I was determined to be the model resident, to prove that I could follow the rules and be a good neighbor despite her scrutiny. Then came the incident with the mailbox. I should mention something about my background that becomes relevant here. I spent 15 years working in federal law enforcement before I retired early, very early, thanks to some smart investments and a consulting business that allows me to work remotely. My specialty was white-collar crime, mail fraud, identity theft, that sort of thing. I still maintain close relationships with former colleagues at various agencies, and I occasionally consult on cases that require my particular expertise. This is important context for what happened next. One afternoon in late March, I went to collect my mail and found my mailbox door hanging open. The mail inside had clearly been disturbed, envelopes pulled out, and haphazardly shoved back in, some of them torn. I assumed it was the mail carrier having a bad day, but when it happened again the next day, and then the day after that, I started to suspect something else was going on. The fourth time it happened, I found a credit card statement opened and then poorly resealed with tape. Now, I am not a paranoid person by nature, but years of working in federal law enforcement teaches you to recognize patterns and take security seriously. Tampering with mail is not just rude or invasive, it is a federal crime, and whoever was doing this was either incredibly stupid or incredibly bold. I set up a small security camera, hidden in the decorative birdhouse mounted on the post next to my mailbox. It had a clear view of the mailbox door and would record any activity with a motion sensor. The very next day, I got an alert on my phone at 2:30 in the afternoon. I pulled up the camera feed and watched in absolute disbelief as Karen Hendricks walked up to my mailbox, looked around to make sure no one was watching, opened it, and proceeded to pull out my mail piece by piece, examining each envelope. She opened a letter from my bank, read it, took a photo of it with her phone, and then stuffed everything back into the mailbox before walking away. I sat there staring at my phone screen, rewinding the footage, making sure I had actually seen what I thought I had seen. Karen Hendricks, HOA president, pillar of the community, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, had just committed a federal felony. And she had done it on camera. In broad daylight. With her face clearly visible. My first instinct was anger. Who did this woman think she was? What possible reason could she have for going through my mail? But anger quickly gave way to curiosity, and then to something else entirely, the realization that Karen had just handed me the keys to her own destruction, and I had not even had to ask for them. I spent the evening reviewing the footage, making backup copies, documenting timestamps, and thinking about my next move. I could confront Karen directly, but that would just lead to denial and excuses. I could report her to the HOA board, but Karen was the board, essentially. She had held the president position for 8 years, and the other board members were either her friends or too intimidated to challenge her. No, this situation called for something more official, more permanent, and infinitely more satisfying. The next morning, I made a phone call to my former colleague, Agent Patricia Morrison, who worked in the FBI's Postal Inspection Division. Yes, the FBI has an entire division dedicated to mail-related crimes, and they take it very seriously. Pat and I had worked together on several cases over the years, and I knew she would be very interested in what I had to show her. Pat, it's me. I need to talk to you about a situation in my neighborhood. How familiar are you with HOA presidents who think they are above federal law? 2 hours later, I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, showing Pat the footage on my laptop. She watched it once, then asked me to play it again, taking notes the second time through. When the video ended, she looked up at me with an expression that was half disbelief, half professional excitement. So let me make sure I understand this correctly. This woman, who has no legal authority beyond a volunteer position in a homeowners association, has been repeatedly opening and reading your mail, including financial documents, for no apparent reason other than what? Nosiness? A power trip? I nodded. I have footage from 4 separate incidents over the past week. She is always careful to look around first, but she never looks up. Never noticed the camera. Pat closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. You know what you have here, right? This is not just a violation of HOA etiquette or a neighborhood dispute. This is 18 U.S.C. Section 1701, obstruction of mail, and 18 U.S.C. Section 1702, taking mail from a mailbox. These are federal felonies. We are talking potential fines up to $250,000 and up to 5 years in prison for each count. I let that sink in. 5 years in prison. For going through a neighbor's mail. Because Karen could not resist the urge to exert control over every aspect of everyone's lives in Meadowbrook Estates. What do you want to do here? Pat asked, though I could tell from her tone that she already knew the answer. Nobody goes through the trouble of documenting federal crimes on video and calling in the FBI just to let it go with a warning. I want to file a formal complaint. I want this investigated properly. And I want Karen to understand that some rules are not HOA bylaws that she can interpret however she wants. Some rules are federal law, and nobody is above them. Pat smiled. I will need to take your statement, collect the evidence, and open an official investigation. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once this train leaves the station, there is no calling it back. I did not hesitate. I'm ready. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation unfolded quietly but thoroughly. Pat and her team discovered that Karen's mail tampering was not limited to my mailbox. She had been going through the mail of at least 6 other residents in Meadowbrook Estates, always during the early afternoon when most people were at work, always using the same method of carefully opening envelopes and resealing them with tape. They found records on her home computer where she had been documenting residents' financial information, tracking their spending habits, noting late payment notices, and using this information to build cases for HOA violations. Apparently, if Karen noticed someone had a letter from a credit card company offering a home equity line of credit, she would then scrutinize their property for unpermitted improvements. If she saw a bank statement showing a large withdrawal, she would watch for new purchases that might violate community guidelines. She had built an entire surveillance operation based on federal mail fraud, all in service of her petty neighborhood kingdom. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from my camera and similar cameras that other residents set up once they learned what was happening. Computer records showing her documentation system. Testimony from multiple victims. Karen had been so confident in her authority, so certain that her position as HOA president gave her special privileges, that she had never considered she might be breaking actual laws, real laws with real consequences. The day they arrested her was a Tuesday, right around noon. I happened to be working in my home office, which has a window overlooking the street, when I saw the 2 black SUV Versas pull up in front of Karen's house. 4 FBI agents stepped out, walked up to her door, and knocked. Not the aggressive power knock that Karen had used on my door months earlier, but the calm, professional knock of law enforcement officers who know they hold all the cards. I watched as Karen opened the door, saw the badges, and her face went through a remarkable transformation from confusion to denial to dawning horror. The agent spoke with her for several minutes on her doorstep. I could not hear what was being said, but I could read the body language. Karen's posture, usually so rigid and authoritative, seemed to collapse inward. Her hands, which typically clutched her clipboard with aggressive confidence, now fluttered uselessly at her sides. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. One of the agents produced a pair of handcuffs. Karen's mouth opened in what I can only imagine was a protest, an explanation, perhaps an appeal to her position as HOA president, as if that title carried any weight with federal agents. But the agent simply gestured for her to turn around, and I watched as Karen Hendricks, the woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood with her petty violations and power trips, was handcuffed and placed in the back of an FBI vehicle. The entire neighborhood came out to watch. Mrs. Chen stood on her porch with her hand over her mouth. The Rodriguez family watched from their front yard. Young Marcus Thompson, who had received those 5 violation notices for parking on the street, actually started clapping until his mother elbowed him to stop. The agents spent another 2 hours searching Karen's house, eventually carrying out several boxes of documents and her computer equipment. The news spread through Meadowbrook Estates faster than any HOA newsletter had ever circulated. Karen had been arrested by the FBI for mail tampering. Federal charges. Potential prison time. The woman who had ruled the neighborhood through fear and endless citations was now facing the very real possibility of becoming a convicted felon. But I was not done yet. See, I had been doing some research during those 3 weeks of investigation, and I had discovered something interesting about Meadowbrook Estates and its HOA structure. According to our state's laws and the community's own bylaws, any HOA board member convicted of a felony involving fraud, theft, or breach of trust is automatically and permanently barred from holding any position of authority in any homeowners association in the state. Not just our neighborhood, but any HOA, anywhere in the state, forever. I also discovered that under our bylaws, if the HOA president is removed or vacates their position, an emergency election must be held within 30 days, and any resident in good standing can nominate themselves for the position. I checked my file. Despite all of Karen's scrutiny and harassment, I had never actually been cited for a legitimate violation. Every citation she had sent me had been either completely fabricated or so petty that I had been able to demonstrate compliance. I was, technically speaking, a resident in excellent standing. The emergency HOA meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community center. The room was packed with residents who had lived under Karen's reign for nearly a decade. Some had moved to Meadowbrook Estates after Karen was already in power and had never known anything different. They assumed that HOAs were supposed to be oppressive and that neighborhood presidents were supposed to rule through fear and constant citations. I stood up during the open forum portion of the meeting and addressed my neighbors. For those who don't know me, I'm the relatively new resident on Maple Drive. Some of you may have heard that I was the one who reported our former president to the FBI. I want to explain why I did that, and what I think we can do to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. I explained how I had discovered Karen going through my mail. How the investigation had revealed she had been doing this to multiple residents. How she had been using illegally obtained financial information to target people with HOA violations. How she had turned a volunteer position meant to maintain community standards into a personal fiefdom where she wielded power without accountability. An HOA is supposed to protect our property values and maintain reasonable standards for our community. It is not supposed to be a tool for one person to harass and intimidate their neighbors. We need leadership that understands the difference between enforcing reasonable rules and using those rules as weapons. We need someone who knows what actual law looks like and understands that accountability applies to everyone, including people in positions of authority. I paused, letting that sink in. I'm nominating myself for HOA president. I'm also proposing that we form a committee to review every citation that was issued in the past 3 years and dismiss any that were based on illegally obtained information or that represent unreasonable interpretations of our bylaws. It's time to rebuild trust in this community, and remember that we are neighbors, not subjects in someone's petty kingdom. The vote was not even close. I won with 83% of the ballots. The remaining 17% went to other candidates. None of Karen's close friends or allies bothered to run once they saw which way the wind was blowing. My first act as HOA president was to establish a resident review board with term limits and transparent procedures for issuing citations. My second act was to revise the bylaws to include checks and balances that would prevent any future president from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Karen had wielded. My third act was to personally go through every citation Karen had issued in her final 2 years and dismiss every single one that could not be justified by a reasonable reading of our community guidelines. Mrs. Chen's mailbox was exactly where it was supposed to be. The Rodriguez family had actually taken their decorations down on January 5th. Karen had just cited them anyway out of spite. Marcus Thompson should never have received 5 violations for a single parking incident during a legitimate home repair. Page after page of petty tyranny, all erased. Karen's criminal case moved through the federal system with the kind of efficiency that only comes from overwhelming evidence and a defendant with no realistic defense. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had not understood the mail tampering laws, that she thought her position as HOA president gave her certain rights to monitor community members, that she had been trying to protect property values. None of it worked. The prosecutor brought out the computer records showing how Karen had systematically tracked financial information from open mail. They showed her notes where she had written things like, Johnson family received credit card offer, watch for unpermitted deck construction, and Patterson got medical bill from fertility clinic, might explain their aggressive attitude at last meeting, use this if they challenge my authority. It was not just mail tampering, it was premeditated, systematic, and frankly kind of disturbing in its thoroughness. Karen pleaded guilty to 4 counts of obstruction of mail and 2 counts of theft of mail, part of a plea agreement that dropped the additional charges related to identity theft and wire fraud that had been discovered during the investigation. The sentencing hearing was set for early December, and based on federal guidelines and the prosecutor's recommendation, she was looking at 18 to 24 months in federal prison, to be followed by 2 years of supervised release, and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. But the real punishment, the one that I think hurt Karen more than anything else, was the loss of her identity. For 8 years, she had been Karen Hendricks, HOA president. That title had been everything to her, the source of her power, her authority, her sense of importance in the world. She had business cards printed with that title. She introduced herself that way at neighborhood gatherings. She wore that embroidered polo shirt like it was a military uniform. Now she was just Karen Hendricks, convicted felon, forever barred from holding any HOA position, living in a neighborhood where everyone knew exactly what she had done and why she had done it. The same neighbors she had intimidated and harassed for years now looked at her with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. I saw her once after the election, about a week before her sentencing hearing. I was checking my mail, appropriately enough, when she walked past on the sidewalk. She stopped when she saw me, and for a moment I thought she might say something, might apologize or try to explain or at least acknowledge what had happened. Instead, she just stood there, staring at me with an expression that contained layers of emotion I could not quite parse. Anger, certainly. Shame, probably. But underneath it all, I saw something that looked like genuine bewilderment, as if she truly could not understand how her reign had ended, how her authority had evaporated, how the person she had tried to control and intimidate had been the one to bring her entire world crashing down. I held up the mail in my hand, the mail that had come through the United States Postal Service and arrived in my mailbox unmolested, as it is supposed to according to federal law. "Have a good day, Karen," I said pleasantly, and walked back toward my house. She was still standing there when I closed my front door, still trying to process the reality of her situation. The woman who had opened my mail looking for ammunition to use against me in some petty HOA dispute had instead opened a door she could never close, a door that led directly to federal prosecution, a criminal conviction, and the complete destruction of the identity she had built for herself over nearly a decade. And the beautiful irony of it all, the thing that I will cherish forever, is that I never had to break a single rule to make it happen. I just had to let Karen be Karen, had to give her enough rope and enough opportunity, and she had hung herself with federal law and her own compulsive need to control everything and everyone around her. She had reached into my mailbox looking for my secrets, my vulnerabilities, my weaknesses, and instead, she had found her own destruction waiting there. Every time I check my mail now, I think about that moment. I think about Karen standing on the sidewalk, her entire world collapsed around her, finally understanding that the rules she had spent years wielding like weapons could also be turned against her when she decided those rules did not apply to her personal crusade for neighborhood dominance. That's the thing about federal law. It does not care if you are an HOA president or just a regular resident. It does not care about your clipboard or your embroidered polo shirt or your 8 years of volunteer service. It applies equally to everyone, and when you break it, especially when you break it repeatedly, deliberately, and systematically, there are consequences that go far beyond a strongly worded letter or a citation notice. Karen wanted to know everything about me. She wanted to find something she could use, some violation she could cite, some leverage she could hold over me to establish her dominance. And in her desperation to find that leverage, she committed a federal crime, not once but dozens of times, all captured on camera, all documented, all completely indefensible. The last thing I heard before she was sentenced was that she tried to explain to the judge that she had only been trying to maintain community standards, that she had taken her responsibilities as HOA president very seriously, that she had never meant for things to go this far. The judge, according to someone who attended the hearing, simply looked at her and said that serious responsibilities require serious judgment, and that using a position of community trust to violate federal law does not demonstrate serious judgment. It demonstrates serious criminal behavior. As Karen stood there in that courtroom, listening to the judge sentence her to 20 months in federal prison, I imagined she finally understood the full scope of what had happened. She had not just lost her position or her reputation. She had not just been arrested or convicted. She had been fundamentally unmade by her own actions, brought down by the very compulsion that had defined her reign. Her need for control, for dominance, for knowing everyone's business and using that knowledge as power had led her to cross a line that she apparently did not even know existed until federal agents were putting handcuffs on her wrists. And as she turned around to be escorted from the courtroom, as she saw the faces of the neighbors she had terrorized for years sitting in the gallery watching her downfall, I like to think that in that moment, she finally realized that the person whose mail she should never have opened was mine, because I was the one person in Meadowbrook Estates who knew exactly what she was doing, exactly what laws she was breaking, and exactly who to call to make sure she faced the full consequences of her actions. The mail she opened looking for my secrets contained nothing but bank statements and credit card offers. The real secret, the one that mattered, was something she never could have found in an envelope. It was written on my resume, embedded in my professional network, hidden in plain sight in my background and experience. I was not just another resident for her to bully. I was her worst nightmare, a person with the knowledge, the connections, and the evidence to turn her federal crime into federal prison time, all without breaking a single rule myself. If you enjoyed this epic tale of how an HOA president's illegal power trip led to her arrest by the FBI, please smash that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World. Drop a comment letting me know what you think about Karen's sentence, whether justice was served, or if you have your own HOA horror stories to share. This channel is dedicated to stories of entitled people facing real consequences, and your support helps me bring you more content like this. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, because trust me, the entitlement never ends, and neither do the stories of people getting exactly what they deserve,